The smell came before the sound. Long before the men heard the wheels, they smelled the stew. It drifted down the muddy communication trench at first light, warm and thick, and impossibly out of place in a world of cold metal and wet wool. And every man who caught it felt the same small, involuntary thing happen inside his chest. Hope. We tend to remember war through its weapons. The rifle, the shell, the tank, the bomber. We picture the generals leaning over maps, the soldiers going over the top, the smoke and the noise. But if you ask the men who actually lived in the trenches of the First World War what they thought about most, hour after hour, day after day, the answer would surprise you. It was not glory. It was not even fear. It was food. This is the untold story of the men who fed an army, and why, in a war defined by machines, the most important person in the trench often carried no weapon at all. To understand why, you have to understand the scale of the problem. An army in the field is, before anything else, a vast and constantly hungry machine. A single British infantry division in the Great War could number 18,000 men, and every one of them had to eat, every single day, in trenches that were often under fire, frequently flooded, and sometimes only a few hundred meters from the enemy. How do you feed 18,000 people in a place where standing upright can get you killed? The men who solved that problem belonged to the Army Service Corps, the branch responsible for supply and transport, the soldiers who moved the food, the fuel, and the equipment. Fighting troops sometimes mocked them as men who never saw the front. The nickname stuck, half joking and half resentful. But the joke missed something important, because the cooks and the ration parties did go forward again and again into the most dangerous ground on earth, and they did it carrying soup. The historian Rachel Duffett spent years studying exactly this. In her book, The Stomach for Fighting, Food and the Soldiers of the Great War, she examined hundreds of letters, diaries, and memoirs left behind by ordinary British soldiers. And what she found was that food was not a footnote to their experience. It was central to it. The arrival of a hot meal could lift a shattered unit. The absence of one could break it. So what did the men actually eat? For much of the war, the staples were grimly familiar. There was bully beef, tinned corned beef, salty and dense, eaten cold straight from the can when nothing could be cooked. There was hardtack, a biscuit so solid that men joked it could stop a bullet, soaked in tea or water just to make it chewable. And there was makanochi, a tinned stew of sliced vegetables and a little meat, produced by a company in Aberdeen, eaten lukewarm so often that soldiers came to dread the very name. It was monotonous. It was repetitive. And in a strange way, it became a shared language. Every man on the Western Front knew the taste, and the complaint, and the small comedy of it. But the thing they truly longed for was warmth. A hot meal in a cold trench was worth more than its calories. It was proof that someone, somewhere behind the lines, still cared whether they lived. And delivering that warmth was where the danger began. Here is what actually happened on a typical night near the front. Far enough back to hide the smoke, the cooks worked over field kitchens, wheeled mobile stoves the soldiers simply called cookers, boiling stew in enormous metal pots known as dixies. Smoke was the enemy. A column of smoke rising over the lines was an invitation to enemy artillery. So much of the cooking happened in the dark, in dugouts, in the small, dangerous hours. Then, once the food was ready, it had to be carried forward. This was the work of the ration party. A handful of men, often exhausted and already half-starved themselves, would heave the heavy dixies onto poles or onto their backs and begin the long walk up the communication trenches toward the front line. These trenches were narrow, slick with mud, and frequently shelled. The pots were scalding. The route could take an hour or more, and the enemy knew roughly when the food came, because hungry armies keep predictable schedules. Imagine that walk. The weight on your shoulders, the hot metal against your spine, the whistle and crump of shells somewhere in the dark, and the knowledge that if you slip, the stew that 200 men are waiting for ends up in the mud at your feet. Was that not, in its own quiet way, one of the bravest jobs in the entire war? Many ration parties never made it. Men were lost carrying soup to their friends, and the survivors learned to grieve in a particular way, not only for the man, but for the food that died with him, because tomorrow there would be hunger where there should have been a meal. The historian Richard Holmes, in his sweeping study Tommy, the British soldier on the Western Front, described how deeply the rhythm of rations shaped trench life. The day was measured not only in stand-tos and sentry duty, but in the arrival or the failure of food. There was the famous rum ration too, a small measure of strong dark rum, issued from a stoneware jar marked with the letters SRD, handed out in the freezing minutes before dawn or before an attack. Officially, it was for warmth and morale. Unofficially, every man understood what it really was. A moment of mercy in a place that offered very few. And here is the part that most histories leave out entirely. We are taught that wars are won by firepower, by bigger guns and better planes and more steel. But food was its own kind of weapon, and the people who managed it shaped the outcome of the fighting as surely as any general. An army that is fed can march, dig, hold, and endure. An army that is hungry begins to come apart from the inside, first in discipline, then in health, then in will. Napoleon is supposed to have said that an army marches on its stomach. The Great War proved him right in the most literal way imaginable. The historian Lizzie Collingham showed just how far this logic reached in the next war. In her landmark book, The Taste of War, World War II, and the Battle for Food, she argued that the Second World War was, in a very real sense, a war about food itself. About who would have enough of it and who would starve. Whole campaigns turned on supply. Armies that outran their kitchens lost battles they should have won. On the freezing Eastern Front, hot food was not a comfort. It was survival itself, the difference between a soldier who could still grip a rifle and one who could not. By the Second World War, the science of feeding soldiers had become an industry. The German field kitchen earned a nickname that captured exactly how soldiers thought of it. The Gulaschkanon, the goulash cannon, because its tall chimney looked like an artillery piece, and because, to a hungry man, hot stew arriving was a kind of firepower of its own. American troops carried compact ration packs designed in laboratories, and behind every advancing army moved the same unglamorous essential machinery the First World War had pioneered: the cooks, the carriers, the quartermasters counting tins. So the next time the story of a great battle is told, listen for what is missing. Behind the famous charge, there was a man stirring a pot. Behind the heroic stand, there was someone who walked through shellfire so the defenders would have something warm in their stomachs at dawn. They won no medals for it. Most of their names were never written down, but they were the reason the line held. You can still find the echo of all this today, if you know where to look. It is in the field kitchens that still follow modern armies into disaster zones and war zones, serving hot meals because commanders have known for a century that a fed soldier is a functioning one. It is in the careful, almost sacred ritual of the shared meal that soldiers describe even now, the one moment in a brutal day when men sit together and are, briefly, just people again. And it is in something far closer to home. It is in the simple, ancient truth your own family already knows, that to cook for someone and to feed them is one of the oldest ways human beings have ever said, "I am taking care of you." That is what those forgotten cooks were really doing in the mud and the dark. Not just filling stomachs, telling frightened, exhausted men that they had not been abandoned, that somewhere behind the noise, someone was still trying to keep them alive. So remember the smell, because for the men in those trenches, it came before the sound of the wheels, and before the relief, and before the small flicker of hope. It was the smell of stew in a freezing dawn, and it meant that they had survived one more night, and that someone, somewhere, still cared whether they saw the next.